Of course, we can't talk about Banksy or the art of protest without dealing with artists who are dealing with one of the larger issues of today. In this case, we are dealing with consumerism, which of course surrounds us and in many ways has become one of the central themes that we see throughout art in the second half of the 20th century. So let's take a look at it. Now, the browsing, selection, and purchase of goods and commodities have become one of the defining activities of modern urban life. In this consumer culture, shopping has become a crucial ritual for shaping and transforming our identities. Let me remind you, after 9/11, mere days after that atrocity in New York City, the first thing that the president did was come out and say, go shopping. Please save our economy. Even today, with people going through all sorts of terrible things, we are told, go shopping. Support the economy. If you don't, things will fall apart. And of course, that gives us this idea of incredible importance attached to what should be nothing more than a chore. Running errands suddenly becomes something more, something larger and societal, which is why artists are going to be dealing with it. Now, artists have always been fascinated and intrigued by the consumer culture and the way it shapes our society. Yet, this relationship between art and the distribution and consumption of commodities has always been a complicated one. Why? Because at the end of the day, art is in and of itself a commodity to be consumed and therefore is part of the system which it is trying to speak to. And you see where this becomes a bit of an issue. So, the questions I'm looking at today deal with these issues. How have artists responded to consumerism through the 20th century? Why is materialism and consumerism such an issue in the 20th century? How do artists like Banksy, English, and Frost build on earlier ideas of anti-consumerist art? And when we talk about consumerism, this is usually artists looking for something deeper, something more. So they're trying to not necessarily say, hey, stop buying things. They're trying to say, hey, there's more to life. And if you can buy things and understand that there's more to life, then maybe this is okay. But usually it's about depth. My goal here is to look at things and understand that while corporations go out of their way to advertise their wares to consumers, I want to look at the artistic response. How do artists use their unique forms to turn social consciousness to materialistic propaganda? So when we look at this, we're looking at what should be cognitive dissonance. I mean, after all, how can a form of communication that is primarily bought and sold argue against the very, purchasing ritual that it strives for? Because, of course, if no one's buying art, no one's supporting the artist. And if no one's supporting the artist, they tend to starve. So you see the issue. But there's a long history here of artists looking at these sorts of ideas. And I want to start with German Expressionism. So we're back in the early 20th century. I'm just setting the groundwork. We can look back much further into ideas from the classical world, from the medieval, etc., looking at consumerism as particularly evil. I want to keep this modern and contemporary. And we're going to start by looking at Kirchner's Street, Dresden, 1908. Now, Kirchner is a very interesting person. He is going to grow up on a German nudist pacifist, or in a German nudist pacifist colony, the sort of thing that only happens in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is obviously going to shape him. Nudity isn't going to be a particular issue. Being a pacifist is going to play into some of his art around World War II. And he's born into what is basically an anti-consumerist culture, whether intended or not. And so this is going to shape how he looks at the world around him. Now, later on, he will leave that colony, go out into the world, and see pieces like this. This is, of course, again, Street, Dresden, painted in 1908. And it's a glimpse into his idea of urban activity before World War I. What we see is a jarring and dissonant painting in both color and composition. We have large women looming into the viewer's space in a confrontational way. They can't be avoided because they're breaking that picture plane. If we come over here and bring up my pen, you'll notice, for example, this figure, based on ideas of photography that we've seen since Impressionism, is breaking the picture plane as if coming out of the frame. Again, this figure in the middle is doing exactly the same thing. The bottom of her skirt breaking through, as if they're coming for us, coming towards us, invading our space, making us feel particularly uncomfortable. The distortion of their figures, the compositional distortion, so the shape, is going to cause us a great deal of discomfort and make them appear ghoulish. But let's go a little bit further. You look at the faces and you'll notice that they're discolored. Here's a green face. Now, obviously that is artificial, but it's showing the appearance of a mask, that these people are not who they seem. These are ghoulish figures lacking soul. Look at the eyes that are particularly black. There's no pupil or anything. And that tells us that these are almost zombies. These are figures that are going through the motions. These are middle-class women in Dresden. Their husbands are the managers or the owners of the factories. And they have the ability to go out and spend their money. And why are they spending it on? They're spending it on status. Because typically, the lower classes, working and poor, don't worry too much about status. They're worried about survival. The very wealthy don't worry about status. People like Warren Buffett, because it doesn't matter. If I'm a billionaire, it doesn't really matter what I drive. But the middle class, famously from the Renaissance to today, is trying to keep up with the Joneses, which is exactly what these women are doing. And it goes a little bit further. The woman in the front is actually holding a human heart. It's a human heart hanging upside down, and giving us that sense again of someone without a heart, without a soul, someone who's focused on the external rather than the internal. So someone who is extrinsic rather than intrinsic. And we have the child in the background. That child is there giving us the idea that they are doing nothing more than training the next generation up, creating a situation where the next generation will know nothing other than this situation. She will grow up and she will ultimately go out and do exactly the same things, doing the shopping and everything else that she saw her mom doing. And she's particularly ghoulish. We don't like the idea of children being tied into consumerism or the ideas of materialism. And yet here we have exactly that. She's standing in front of that train, almost or tram in this case, symbolizing the idea that there's nothing she can do. She will be hit by this. She will be part of this. And when we look at overall, it's his sort of pacifist, vegan, nudist, non-materialist view of what's going on the high street in downtown Dresden at the time. He's trying to get across his discomfort with all of this materialism, with all of the shopping and everything else that's going on. That's why he's using pinks and greens and dissonant colors. He's trying to make us feel the same discomfort that he does when it comes to these ideas of consumerism. But this isn't the only artist we're looking at. There's also Duchamp and Dada. Now, Duchamp began by presenting objects themselves as art. He would create this idea of the ready-made, which I'll define in a moment. There's a mass-produced, commercially available objects. Designating them as art simply gave them titles. So in other words, he goes out and finds a bottle rack, says this bottle rack is art, signs it from Duchamp, and it becomes art, even though it's a bottle rack. Now, ready-mades are ordinary manufactured objects that the artist selects and modifies as an anecdote to what he would call retinal art. So it's the choice of the object that makes it art, not the object itself. Although, when we are looking at this idea of ready-mades, what we are looking at is something where he's subverting art. He's subverting the art market. How? Well, he's taking something that would typically be seen as commercial art or industrial art, and he's declaring it high art as if it's something that belongs in a gallery. And he's arguing that someone designed it, someone came up with those rings and the hooks and everything that you put the bottles on, so why not? And he's doing this as a protest against war, against World War I. That's why Dada does a lot of what it does. But he's basically saying, he's mixing these ideas of high art and low art. He's saying that almost anything can be art simply by being accepted by the artist. This is sort of the artist becoming philosopher rather than the artist as craftsman. So he's finding these objects that are mass-produced. In seeking to select mass-produced objects, Duchamp and others considered the relationship between art, technology, and industry. The 20th century, of course, saw a radical shift in the way that objects were made through increased mechanization and the rollout of factories across the world. And even art today will be mass-produced. We see pieces like this here. The same quote-unquote original oil painting actually comes off of a giant inkjet printer, gets stretched onto a canvas, gets painted, gets retouched, and gets sold as original, even though it's not really original, because you can see there's thousands of copies or hundreds of copies. Mass production encourages the population to consider objects in terms of their function as opposed to their beauty. These are both vacuums, and yet one is pure function and would look particularly ugly in your home, and the other one is form with function. And so he's kind of getting at these ideas of mass production. The problems of mass production, that some things are just unaesthetic. And if you're going to live life once, why live it unaesthetically? Yet, through Readymades, artists could encourage their viewers to rethink these objects and consider them for their aesthetic beauty rather than their predefined purpose. So in other words, instead of seeing simply a metronome, you see a metronome with an eye, you start to question the eye, you look at the form of the metronome, suddenly we're looking at a metronome not as a metronome, but as potentially a piece of design, a piece of art. So, post-war consumerism. In the middle 1950s, when the art world got a new movement which oddly both celebrated and criticized consumption choices and mass production. Now, to give you a little bit of idea of what's going on in this post-war era, 1945 to 1955, we will see household incomes triple. When you hear about single income homes, that's something that historically doesn't generally happen. There are very rare instances where you see single family homes or single income homes below really the upper middle class. Anywhere below that, you can't really afford it. Most people are, going to have dual incomes, etc. I know it's not what we see or we hear about, but it is the case. 1945 to 55, because incomes triple, it becomes very easy to have a single income home. And that will continue through the 1970s into the 1980s, at which point it falls apart and you go back to more or less dual income, unless you're in the upper middle class, sort of back to the historical standard. So, of course, with all of this extra money, there's extra stuff to buy, and so advertising becomes a huge part of it. Different companies want you to buy their stuff as opposed to their competitors. The movement in question, better known as pop art, saw familiar imagery and products around us as an inspiration. Famous brands, paparazzi photos of celebrities, and the visual language of advertising. As the post-war era was marked by the inevitable period of prosperity and the rise of capitalism, a particular consumer lifestyle started to emerge in the United States. In the society that promoted the lifestyle of leisure and consumption, material objects and consumer goods crept into the art world, as we had never seen before. Immersing themselves completely into the mundane living experience, pop artists created something that they thought was nowhere to be found within museums and galleries. Artwork talking about our everyday lives and experiences. Here, Jasper Johns is creating Flag, and he creates numerous versions of this. And the entire purpose of it is to look at a flag, something that you'd probably see 5, 10 or more times a day, and ask us to see it as art, something very different from where we usually see it. And ultimately, pop art is all about capitalism, the unlimited market, sex, spending money, having it all, and wanting more. This presence of well-known corporate symbols and mass-produced goods in modern art reflected the commercialization of popular culture. In other words, the more commercial popular culture gets, the more it's going to be reflected in art, because art must reflect society, otherwise it's known as, well, irrelevant. Now, common objects of our wealthy society were taken out of context and scrutinized for their symbolic value. In other words, let's take a common object like a flag or a target and look at it as art. By celebrating commonplace objects and people of everyday life, pop art aimed to elevate pop culture to the level of fine art, taking things like comic books that are supposed to be disposable and turning them into giant canvases that belong in museums. Incorporating various aspects of the mass culture, such as advertisement, comic books, or industrial labeling, pop artists created kitschy combinations of commercialized and recognizable elements. When American pop art was more interested in blurring the boundaries between high and low art, while American pop art was more interested in blurring the boundaries between high art and low culture, pop art in the UK was much more critical towards this consumer culture that was being exported across the continent. So in the UK, pop art is going to be more anti-materialistic, whereas in the United States, it's about high art versus low art. While some artists wanted to call attention to mass banality and spiritual nakedness of consumer goods, others were simply appropriating these images because they were fond of them, not as a referential symbol that screams with meaning. In other words, there are times that the symbol simply is a symbol. Thus, critics disagree whether pop art represents a critique or a celebration of consumer culture. Sort of depends on your perspective. At first perceived as an American phenomenon, the consumerist lifestyle soon spilled over to the rest of the world through globalization, the rise of corporations, and of course the spread of the free market economy. Unlike pop art's playful and often ambivalent attitude towards the consumer culture, the generation of artists that came after took a more decisive and hostile stand towards it. People like Andy Warhol. Just imagine the world of pop art without Andy Warhol, or maybe his Marilyn Monroe paintings that he paints in the wake of her death and comes out and says, yes, I'm taking advantage of her death. I'm capitalizing on it. I'm using her image. I'm going to make some money off of it. That's the sort of thing we're not supposed to say. We're quiet about that. We do it, but we don't talk about it. Or for that matter, Campbell's Soup cans. When we look at his Campbell's Soup cans from 1962, this consisted of 32 canvases, all looking the same, yet depicting different variations of soup. The artwork brought an entire shelf of these cans straight from the supermarket onto our walls, presenting it as a piece of fine art. And what you see is a silkscreen technique. So he's using the same silkscreen, basically a stencil, to create the entire can, with the exception of the title, with the exception of the name of the soup in the can, which he is painting by hand, giving it that slightly off look, almost uncanny valley sort of look here. Now, apparently it was a gallery owner by the name of Latow who suggested to Warhol to make this a series, as well as his legendary dollar sign paintings. After she asked him what he most loved, the pop art genius replied, money, and then mentioned they drank Campbell's Soup every day for lunch for almost 20 years. There you have it. The backbone of consumerist culture, art. Paint what you love, even if it happens to be Brillo scouring pads or Campbell's Soup or Coke bottles or, well, any number of other things. Which brings us to Richard Hamilton, who creates Just What Is It That? And the full title is Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing? As pop art originated in the UK, it was only logical that the first iconic artworks came from these pioneering artists, such as Richard Hamilton. His 1956, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing, is a collage and one of the first artworks to comment on the conditions of modern life, depicting a fantasy of an ideal scenario that everyone supposedly wishes for. So what he's showing is a home filled with the perfect forms that we see from advertisements. For example, the perfect male form, the perfect female form, perfect plant, or a poster getting at ideas of the perfect domestic life, or the perfect canned ham, which is an actual thing. Yes, they used to put hams in cans, or vacuum cleaners that can reach all the way up a staircase. And where's he getting these ideas? Well, he's taking these images from American magazines. In fact, here are some of the images now, and reappropriating them in the name of art. The collage ultimately consists of a modern-day living room filled with all of these ideas. We see a bodybuilder, a burlesque dancer, suggesting perfect bodies. A TV is something every household needs. A bold use of color, and much more. For a proper ovation and critique of consumerism. If you don't have a Ford, then it's not really a home, is it? Or recording equipment, or television, or any number of other things. This is the same exact idea that we get when we create a collage out of magazines in grade school or high school, trying to create the perfect form, and what we get, or the perfect face, or whatever it's going to be, and what you get is something that looks like a monstrosity. And that's intentional. You can't avoid it because you're leaving out the interaction between the things. And that's what's happening here. There is no interaction between the things. That's why everything stands out. And it becomes this sort of monstrosity, this Frankenstein's monster of the things that we're supposed to see. It's supposed to call your attention to the fact that maybe you don't need these things. Maybe there's something simpler. Then we have Litzenstein, who creates blonde waiting. Now, Litzenstein is going to start as a fairly realistic painter, and then almost overnight turn to pop art. His idea is taking comic books, something that is going to be disposable, and borrowing single panes, single pieces, and then putting them up. Now, he's working at the same time that we see Jackson Pollock in abstract expressionism. The difference is Litzenstein is using concrete images to draw out your train of thought, your ideas, the same way that Pollock is using splattered paint. And so, even though it's the same idea, very different way of going about it. So he is inevitably part of our selection, and among his many comic book based works, we see blonde waiting. And what he's doing here is he is adopting all of the visual language of the comic books. So where you see pure color, in other words, no dots, black, yellow, blue, red, well, those are the CMYK colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And those can be printed pure. But when we need to mix colors, something that's reddish or flesh tone, or eyes that are not quite deep blue, that's where you start using halftone or Ben-Day dots to create that image, because you're overlaying those colors or putting them next to each other to create the illusion of another color. And he's doing this quite intentionally. This is bringing that comic book idea, that low art idea, into the gallery. Now, many of his ideas will tackle the relationship between men and women by telling their stories and thoughts. This particular painting is a true example of a relatable image, the one you look at and instantly feel connected to. Here we see a woman sitting at home waiting for something. And it's taken from this comic book image, which we see on the left. We see the Litzenstein painting on the right. And it really doesn't matter who the woman is. It could actually be anyone. And interestingly, your train of thought, your emotional state, your ideas of the time will change how you see it. She could be angry, she could be sad, she could be frustrated, she could be waiting for a lover, she could be waiting for a phone call, she could be waiting for her grade from World of the Arts. She could be frustrated the class hasn't started yet, or frustrated that it's still going on and this guy is still talking about this flippin' painting having something to do with comic books. I need to stop, moving on. So it doesn't really matter how he's depicting her, but he is depicting modern society, regardless of the fact that she's nothing more than a figure of black lines and red dots. She symbolizes something that we all feel, something that is universal to all of us, the idea of waiting, uncomfortably waiting. This is not comfortable waiting. This is not, you're waiting to fall asleep and you know it's going to be a minute or two until you do and everything's perfectly fine. This is that sort of anxious waiting for something to happen. And when it's being painted in the 50s and 60s, that's common. We're in the middle of the Cold War. We're waiting for the world to end. These are deeper pieces. So let's look at some more modern representations of consumerism. Today, many contemporary artists explore and criticize the idea of consumerism in a variety of ways. Rather than criticizing the consumption on a superficial level, they tend to deconstruct this phenomena from the inside out. In other words, they start to tear it apart and try and look at specific individual elements so that it calls your attention to these issues. And we start with Barbara Kruger, untitled, although it's also known as I Shop, Therefore I Am. You may not know her name, but you sure know her art. Barbara Kruger creates these massive pieces. These are based on her experience and her knowledge of commercial art, industrial art, and in this case, specifically advertising, the use of typography, in other words, the use of language in art, the use of photography, the idea of getting a message across in 5 seconds so that you know that you're supposed to go and buy a Big Mac or, go and buy whatever the other thing is. And so she's using that to her advantage. And these are very similar to the kinds of advertisings we might see covering walls, billboards, buses, trains, buildings, etc. Except we are used to seeing it say Supreme or saying whatever brand happens to be in that advertisement. Now, she is a prolific feminist and conceptual artist and creates tongue-in-cheek graphic design pieces, one of the most famous, of course, being this. Very much up to date with the latest happenings within consumerist culture and the news of the world, she issues commentary that gets adopted as the mantra for the very groups it targets, in this case, compulsive shoppers. So what's happening here is she's pulling out something that, again, is a truth, something that we're all aware of, this idea that I must go shopping, or shopping feels good, or retail therapy, or whatever you want to put it. But makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable because instead of saying, I shop and I enjoy it, it's I shop, therefore I am. And so giving that idea of shopping sort of the gloss of identity. I shop, therefore I can be identified. And for many of us, that's actually the case. Think about your clothing. You buy certain brands or clothes with certain logos or whatever as an identifier because you don't want to walk around saying, I go to this university, guys. No, you want to wear the sweatshirt. You don't want to say, I believe in these ideals, or I'm from this socioeconomic class, or I believe in these sorts of hobbies. No, you go to Abercrombie or American Eagle. These are all symbols. And we get those symbols through shopping rather than, conversing. And so she's bringing that out, that shopping creates identity, something that when we really start thinking about it, should make you feel fairly uncomfortable. And what we see is something that is almost an advertising line from her, ready to hit t-shirts and shopping bags had it not been a critique of capitalism and its social issues. Which brings us to Damien Hurst. Now, Damien Hurst is an English artist, and he has said that art is about life, and it can't really be anything else. It has to refer to life. This is something that I've talked about in many lectures, the idea that art must reflect society, and if it doesn't, that's a huge issue. Now, in a series of memorable works, often involving provocative materials such as flies, dead animals, and formaldehyde, Hurst has made uncompromising statements about the transience of life, the temporary nature of our very existence, and thereby makes us question why in the world are we doing these things, such as going out and shopping, when we should be doing other things. After all, no one on their deathbed has ever said, you know what? I regret not having a larger SUV. I regret not buying that bigger house or going into more debt. It just generally doesn't happen. So in this installation, Pharmacy, he recreates the clinical atmosphere of, well, a pharmacy. He views medicine as a powerful belief system, one that seduces all of us, making us believe that these drugs will cure all ills and preserve life. Although we rarely question their rather nasty side effects at times. We hear them on TV, and we hear about nausea and growing a second head and becoming 60 feet tall before disappearing completely, and we ignore that because it's going to make us feel better or make us live longer. The pharmacy, in this case, with its cool white shelves of classified bottles and boxes, seems to be a model of minimalist order, banishing fear of death and decay. After all, no matter what you have, we can solve it, right? With the right medication. However, when you look at the step stools, you see bowls of honeycomb. And we see an insect electrocutor hanging from the ceiling. The honeycomb is to draw flies in. The insect light is to kill them, thus reminding us of the cycle of life, or just a general reminder of mortality, a memento mori. The honey, of course, will lure the flies, only to bring them to a quick and rather brutal death when they're zapped and explode, which seems like a quick way to go. I guess it depends on, well, how you look at things. In a similar way, medicine, of course, will promise much, but can only stave off the inevitable end. As Hurst puts it himself, quote, "We all die." So this kind of big, happy, smiling, minimal, colorful, confident facade that medicine and drug companies put up is not flawless. Your body lets you down, but people want to believe in some kind of immortality. It's an easy thing to believe for many of us, especially when we're younger, especially when we seem indestructible. And at the time you hear that and you hear people talk about it and you go, nah, that's not me. But no, it really is. Especially when you get older and you realize, hey, there are these issues that we need to deal with. There's aches and pains that come from injuries from years ago. There's all sorts of possible chronic conditions that can start popping up as you age. And so what he's doing is bringing out this reality, again, a reality that's really uncomfortable. Medical consumption, medical consumerism, and bringing it to the fore. He's making us feel uncomfortable to get across a message. Speaking of uncomfortable, let's talk about Banksy. And here we see Jesus Christ with shopping bags. Sometime around Christmas 2005, Banksy went around to produce the Jesus Christ with shopping bags stencil and screen print as a can it be more clear call out on consumerism. In the work, we see a worn out Jesus on an invisible crucifix carrying shopping bags full of goodies. So remember, this is being done around Christmas. And this is the ultimate sort of look at that idea of what is the reason for the season. And some would argue it's axial tilt, but others might say, it's shopping and gifts and showing people that you care by spending large amounts of money on them. Or others would say it's all about Jesus, who would never have gone in for any of this materialism in the first place. And yet we see these two ideas coming together in this cognitive dissonance, which is Christmas. This is surely not the first time that Banksy draws our attention to the real meaning of things such as holidays or just consumer culture. Dismaland would be a great example. Yet, this work carries a special force with it, as it has to do with religion. When did obsessive shopping for things we don't need replace the true spirit and values of Christmas, such as compassion, love, and forgiveness? What looks like someone satirizing the idea of Jesus is actually pointing out the dissonance that is this holiday. pointing out that on one side we talk about helping the poor, and then on the other side we talk about, oh my gosh, the 57-inch TV is on sale. Let's get that. I have empty wall space. This is not the sort of thing that we find in the book of Ecclesiastes. So he's trying to push that, which makes us uncomfortable, makes us think about why are we doing it in the first place, which is exactly his point. One might think that this is what Jesus ended up dying for when we look at this. And you could argue that maybe that's what modern Christmas is, and you can argue about whether it should go back to a previous form or whether this is fine or any number of other things. Banksy is simply pointing out something, and really Banksy, Kruger, and others are, Hurst being another one, are simply holding up a mirror. They're reminding us of who we are. And as much as we want to say, no, that's not me, I'm enlightened. Yeah, it is. Because you're out there buying the fancy new cool Polly Pocket thing for your daughter, or the cool new Hot Wheels set that costs $150 for your son, or maybe you bought the Hot Wheels thing for your daughter because, hey, what the heck? But at the end of the day, you're still proving your love through money and stuff, mostly plastic stuff, but we'll leave that part out. Now, Banksy does another piece called Gross Domestic Product. This is done in 2019, and this is an installation piece. So in other words, it's installed. You don't walk through it in this case. You just look in. These are shop windows. Let me go back. So there are 3 of these shop windows. Gross Domestic Product, of course, referring to the economy. And here we see pieces, and everything in here is not quite what it seems. We see a tiger skin rug. Yeah, cool. And then we see it's Tony the Tiger with rotten teeth because Frosted Flakes are covered in sugar. We see drones up above bombing what appears to be a landscape below. We see Rage the flower thrower over here in 2 paintings. We see pillows that say life's too short to take advice from a cushion. Or here, this beautiful swan neck toilet bowl cleaner followed by a bunch of little ducklings. I mean, it's all getting you to question sort of what are our assumptions? What are our ideas? Here's another window. We see a disco ball. We see a bulletproof vest with the Union Jack. We see a grave and a crucifix turned into a grappling hook, as if it's being used to pull in ideas that aren't actually Christian in the first place. The third window, this is the last of the 3, includes some of his spray painted art, pieces that refer to other things. And by the way, at the time that this comes out, there's a website where you can buy some of these things. And so he's trying to get you to question the world around you, question your ideas and your assumptions, including your need to buy things. Because do you really need that thing that you just bought? And the answer is probably not. Which brings us to Ron English. And he creates Super Supper, 2010. This is a piece, I'm going to pop back here. This is a piece that's done around the time that you see Super Size Me and all these ideas around McDonald's and supersized meals and giant piles of French fries and giant piles of soda, if you can put soda in piles. But I guess maybe keep going with me. It's just go with the point. For many, when thinking about Ron English, the first thing that comes to mind is that Hulk-like baby, or in this case, famous paintings. He tends to look at the implication of something. So Tony the Tiger in this case, rather than rotten teeth, as an obese figure, because of course we see Tony the Tiger selling sugary food that isn't healthy for us anyway. We know that. It's like having dessert for breakfast, but you wouldn't give a piece of cake to your 8-year-old. You would theoretically give a bowl of Frosted Flakes to them, usually because they don't want to eat the other stuff and it's just not worth the fight. But moving on. Super Supper, created in 2010, draws inspiration, or pays homage, if you will, to The Last Supper. Of course, in this case, only Jesus is moved or changed into Ronald McDonald, and his disciples are various cartoon characters, various consumer materialistic symbols that we love and grew up with. from Popeye to Homer Simpson. So it kind of hits all of the generations. And it's getting across this idea of making us question art being a symbol of the sublime, of things that can't be purchased, of the non-materialistic, non-consumerist, and juxtaposing it with what are our real, everyday interests. We want to go to Big Boy, who's over there on the left. We want to go to Disneyland. We want to watch The Simpsons. We want to eat Frosted Flakes or go to McDonald's. When in reality, what we should be thinking of is much deeper things, much deeper ideas, such as the creation of man. You see Adam on the ceiling there. But we don't. We don't think of that. Because day to day, those deeper ideas get lost in the shuffle of what we need to do. So that's what he's getting at. He describes his work as a mashup of high and low cultural touchstones, which is what characterizes the entire propaganda series of works that he creates. When it comes to other known paintings, the artist did his own version of Starry Night, The Scream, and Son of Man, each one getting at different ideas. The Son of Man, of course, the anonymity of the Belgian middle class in the original by Magritte, being juxtaposed with this idea of the apple being eaten because there's just nothing left, it's rotten, and we see the person is dead, referring to their soul, as if this is the physical reality, but this is their soul, having sold it for 20, 30 years to the office. So we get very different ideas. It's basically him saying, hey, we need to think of deeper things. We also have dot masters. Now known for trashing the consumerism, quite literally, Leon Sesix, better known as dot masters, just won't leave pop culture alone. What he does is he creates these images where we see garbage bags and then we see these designer bags. And again, it's a juxtaposition because the designer bag that was so important on the high street or on Main Street when you were walking out of the store to show everyone that you'd been to Gucci is now nothing more than garbage. And that's where it all ends up. I mean, it's fast fashion. It's the sort of thing that's going to disappear anyway. Giant clothing brands like Chanel or Nike, which he loves to pack up in a black dumpster bag and dispose of, or use them as dispenser for his spray cans and paint rollers, as in the case of high rollers. So here again, we see those really expensive bags becoming trash, referring again to the things that were in them that so rapidly become trash. Using typical English humor, the dot master also likes to play with dollar bills, embellishing them with pop drawings of a recurring face like Chairman Mao, or reinterpret the famous artworks like the Mona Lisa or Michelangelo's Creation of Adam. Or here we see Miley Cyrus, Amy Winehouse, David Bowie, and others. So he's trying to get at this idea of pop culture again as something that is almost a false idol. That we should be looking for something very different, but we don't. Which brings us to Ben Frost and a piece of art called Store in a Dark Place. So Australian artist Ben Frost likes to combine elements of popular culture to create new dialogues. In this case, in one of his latest works from 2015, Store in a Dark Place, also known as Mickey on Prozac, we have a sad Mickey Mouse character, painted over a disposed pharmaceutical packaging of Prozac, one of the most prescribed antidepressants in the world. And what he's doing is again using juxtaposition. Let's take two opposite things, or two things that should be opposite, put them together, and it's going to draw out the idea. Just like you have a foil in television or theater where you have Watson and Sherlock and they have very different ideas, and one is very logical, one is very emotional. When you put them together, they draw out that difference. And we see this in a number of shows. Same idea here. Mickey Mouse is supposed to be a happy character, right? He's supposed to be bouncing around, doing his thing. I do a Mickey Mouse voice, but I'd probably be arrested by the Disney police. And Prozac is something you take when you're sad. And yet when you're on Prozac, you shouldn't be sad. And so it's getting us to question. And the question isn't the usefulness of Prozac as such, it's more about the commercialism. Because Mickey is ultimately a commercial figure, and Prozac is something that's been advertised on TV, in magazines, in everywhere for the better part of 30 years. And so we see these elements of advertising put together. We see this juxtaposition of happiness and sadness, drawing out these ideas, kind of getting us to look at this confrontation. Now, Frost is known for his confrontational and controversial collages, oversaturated with images from all spheres of life. These works are quite simple and yet very visually clear. Other pieces from the series include Mr. Burns from The Simpsons on a box of Viagra. Sort of the idea of who gets to control sexuality and don't question that person and their need for Viagra, but they can question others. Or The Witch from Hansel and Gretel, gracing a Botox box. Or in this case, I think it might be from Snow White, but either way. It's that juxtaposition. It tells us what the medicine does. Botox eliminates wrinkles. Viagra makes you... it's Viagra. And that juxtaposition draws it out, but also by using commercial forms, Mr. Burns and The Witch from possibly Snow White, you put those together and we get at the ideas of advertising. There are multiple meanings, there are deeper meanings, but all of them make us question the ideas of consumerism and materialism that surround us on a day-to-day basis. So let's draw this to a bit of a conclusion, with another piece by Ben Frost showing Daffy Duck angry on a Ritalin package. So, how have artists responded to consumerism through the 20th century? Well, there have been a lot of artists who have responded to consumerism. We have people like Kirchner, who's trying to show us his view. This piece is another one by Kirchner. His view of what consumerism looks like from the outside, from the eyes of someone who isn't part of that culture. Or pop art that uses exactly that imagery to draw out different ideas. Perhaps to make us second guess why we're so into the consumer products that we are in the first place. Or pieces like this by Dwayne Hansen. This style is called super realism. That again gets that idea of identity through shopping. One that we've seen from Kruger. All of these artists are responding to consumerism primarily as a surface level, as a shallow existence in a world in which there is so much depth if you just stop and look. By the way, exactly the same argument could be made for screens and social media and all of these ideas. Maybe a little different art, same concept. So why is materialism and consumerism such an issue in the 20th century? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, inequity. There's huge amounts of inequity. Look at this piece. Here we have African Americans lining up at a food pantry in front of a sign saying the world's highest standard of living. These inequalities continue to grow. We have a working class that continues to lose power, lose income, lose the ability to support themselves, whereas the upper classes continue to grow and prosper. And their money is coming from the working class, but the working class can't do anything about it. This inequality becomes very, very important to the artists. Also, ideas like pollution will become very important, especially in an age where we're constantly talking about climate change and what's going to happen to the planet in 10, 20, 30 years. And so these become important material and consumer culture issues that artists want to draw out. How do artists like Banksy and Ron English build on earlier ideas of anti-consumerist art? Well, English is going to do it by basically satirizing. Everyone's kind of satirizing what's going on, but satirizing it. Here's a piece by Ron English, and giving us that idea of things are not quite what they seem. For example, we might see sex everywhere. We might see over-sexualization as a particular issue, as we see here. Banksy tends to look at it and give us images focusing on the social side of it. He's really building on the realist tradition and on Kirchner's tradition. But in his case, using very simple graphics, very similar to Barbara Kruger, to get across a very specific image or idea. And Frost is doing so through depictions of medications, looking at that idea of advertising medications, which seems so problematic. You don't really, when you think about it, you don't walk into a lawyer's office and say, hey, I want you to file exactly this brief, yada, yada, yada. No, you say, here's the situation and what should I do? And the lawyer says, hey, I'm an expert and I can do this. But in the doctor's office, we're happy to walk in and go, I want Prozac. I want the blue pill or Botox or whatever it's going to be. It's a very interesting situation. And so these artists are building on these earlier ideas created by people like Kirchner, by the pop artists, by Barbara Kruger, and continuing that idea through. And this is being recorded in the summer of 2022. As I record, we have inflation around 6%. The economy is taking a bit of a downturn. No one's sure what's going to happen. And these anti-consumerist sentiments become much stronger during these downturns. The reason is we're going to be bombarded with far more advertising because all of these companies are desperate for you to walk into their doors, into their store, and buy their thing because, well, a lot of people don't have money, and so they're just not going to buy it at all. And so you're about to get bombarded by this, potentially. Now, everything may work out, and that's fine. But these anti-consumerist sentiments will be there. And at the end of the day, again, it's not about don't buy the latest thing, because there are things that might bring you happiness. You might buy a book, which gives you an idea that makes you a happier person. But at the end of the day, you can't actually buy, well, enlightenment or affirmation or validation. You can't buy any of the things that we're told we need to find. It's just not available, and these artists are pointing it out. They're basically saying, think more deeply. Move beyond simple purchases and the day-to-day mundane, and think on a spiritual level, and you will live a happier life.